Well, in 2019, I read the book. I was sent the book by my book agent and friend at the time, and I was looking for films that could inspire, that were commercially viable, but also could really like reach in and touch somebody's heart. And
Blake Lively is now at the center of allegations involving a disputed smear campaign, a contested lawsuit, and a cache of private texts that complicate the public story. And that's where this begins, because the same communications, later cited as evidence of coordinated media manipulation, were reportedly available in full before selective excerpts ever reached the press. That matters. Justin Baldoni appears in those same threads, asking directly whether anyone was deploying bots, reacting to escalating headlines, and responding to coverage from TMZ, Daily Mail, and even the New York Times. This is where it tightens, because if complete exchanges include denials, context, and internal debate, yet only certain lines surface publicly, the framing itself comes under scrutiny. And this is where pressure builds. Colleen Hoover enters the picture through private messages that reveal fracture, distance, and disagreement over edits, promotion, and public positioning. But that wasn't the only complication. Alongside the public narrative sits an 89-page CRD draft complaint filed in California, referencing communications reportedly extracted from raw data using what has been described as a forensic tool. There are claims of unauthorized access. There are references to the California Penal Code. There are arguments about whether some materials could be challenged under poisonous tree principles. And that changes the equation, because this isn't just a feud amplified across TikTok. It's a multi-front conflict, legal, corporate, and PR, unfolding in real time. And the unresolved question remains, if the full exchanges show both tension and denial, why elevate only one version of the narrative? Once that question lands, everything shifts. This is where it tightens. Because while Blake Lively publicly referenced an alleged smear campaign, the underlying texts tell a more layered story. Inside the same threads cited in the lawsuit, Justin Baldoni is seen directly asking his team whether anyone was using bots to defend him online. The response: "We can fully confirm we do not have bots." That wasn't the only complication. The communications reportedly include internal reactions to escalating headlines, concerns about coverage from TMZ, Daily Mail, and Entertainment Weekly, and discussions about whether responding would fuel the feud further. That changes the equation, because if full exchanges include denials, hesitation, and attempts to avoid escalation, yet the public framing centers on coordinated media manipulation, then the spotlight shifts from what was said to what was emphasized. And this is where pressure builds. The materials allegedly originated from communications tied to Jennifer Abel, formerly associated with JonesWorks and Stephanie Jones, and reportedly totaled 316 megabytes of reconstructed raw data. That's not a single screenshot, that's volume. But here's what complicates everything. The extraction process itself has been challenged, with references to potential unauthorized access, use of a forensic tool, and possible violations of the California Penal Code. If those arguments gain traction, opposing counsel could argue the material is vulnerable under poisonous tree doctrine principles, meaning the debate shifts again. Not just, was there a smear campaign, but is the evidence itself legally sustainable? And this is where it escalates, because once credibility questions attach to the foundation of an 89-page CRD draft complaint, every selective excerpt becomes subject to scrutiny. Meanwhile, public perception continues to form across TikTok, amplified by the New York Times coverage and online speculation about who was trying to cancel whom. But the unresolved loop remains. If the full threads show both tension and denial, why spotlight only one side? And if the data is challenged, what survives? Because once narrative control becomes the battleground, perception can move faster than proof. And in a conflict involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and media institutions at scale, that velocity matters. This is where it shifts, because the fight between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni doesn't just hinge on what was said in the texts, it hinges on how those texts were obtained, and that changes everything. The communications reportedly came from a device associated with Jennifer Abel, previously tied to JonesWorks under Stephanie Jones. According to filings, the phone was accessed shortly before Abel's departure, and what followed allegedly involved deep extraction of raw data, not just surface-level screenshots. This is where it tightens. There are references to a sophisticated forensic tool commonly associated with high-level data recovery, sometimes identified as Celebrite, capable of reconstructing root data even after factory resets. That's not casual access, that's technical intervention. And here's where pressure builds. Abel's subsequent lawsuit reportedly invokes violations of the California Penal Code, specifically around unauthorized access, copying, and dissemination of private communications. There are also allegations of promissory fraud tied to claims that certain assurances were made regarding the handling of the device. Now, we're no longer debating PR optics, we're debating liability. But this complicates everything, because if the extracted material becomes central to an 89-page CRD draft complaint, and that extraction is challenged under anti-hacking statutes, then opposing counsel could argue the evidence is legally tainted. That's where the poisonous tree argument enters. If the root is contested, the fruit is vulnerable. And this is where it escalates, because if a court were to scrutinize how the material was obtained or whether consent was properly given, then the entire evidentiary foundation supporting the smear campaign narrative could be subject to review. That doesn't mean the claims collapse, but it does mean the battlefield shifts again, from PR to statutory exposure to procedural risk. Meanwhile, public coverage continues. New York Times, Daily Mail, online discourse on TikTok, largely detached from the technical legal arguments unfolding beneath. But here's the unresolved loop. If the foundation is challenged, what happens to the structure built on top of it? And if the structure weakens, who absorbs the reputational fallout? Because once a conflict moves from narrative control into statutory territory, referencing the California Penal Code, unauthorized access, and potential evidentiary exclusion, the stakes are no longer just public, they're procedural. And procedural fights don't trend. They decide outcomes. The rupture didn't happen in public. It unfolded inside private messages, because the dispute between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni didn't escalate in isolation. It intersected with communications involving Colleen Hoover that reveals something deeper than a press feud. They reveal fracture. In mid-August, Hoover reportedly sent messages expressing frustration over back-and-forth articles, promotional positioning, and what she described as feeling isolated while online backlash intensified. And this is where the dynamic shifts. She referenced disagreements over the script, concerns about how the ending of the film was changed, and frustration surrounding a proposed documentary and a disputed donation tied to 1% proceeds from a potential coffee book. That wasn't the only complication. She also referenced communication breakdown, saying she felt forced to choose sides, and later distancing herself from individuals connected to the production. This is where pressure builds. Because in her messages, Hoover reportedly stated she didn't see a future relationship with people involved in the project. That includes emotional distance from the broader production circle. That changes the equation. Now, this isn't just about alleged media manipulation or a claimed smear campaign. It's about alliance collapse. And this is where it escalates. Because responses attributed to Justin Baldoni appear to emphasize that he did not contribute to negative headlines, did not coordinate attacks, and remained open to direct communication. He reportedly referenced earlier collaboration, offered to share screenshots, and denied intentionally harming anyone connected to the film. But here's what complicates everything. Hoover's reply suggested she believed certain explanations were framed in ways that could protect public image if leaked. That introduces another layer. Not confirmation, not proof, but perceived positioning, and perception drives fracture. This is where tension compounds, because if Blake Lively had visibility into these exchanges, including acknowledgments of miscommunication, references to venting, and attempts to de-escalate, then the public framing of a unified narrative becomes harder to sustain. Now we have three battlefields intersecting: legal risk, corporate alignment, and personal trust. And when personal trust collapses, narratives splinter. The unresolved loop expands. If private communications reflect confusion, hurt, and breakdown rather than coordination, why does the public storyline appear consolidated? Because once alliances fracture, strategy recalibrates. And when strategy recalibrates, leverage shifts. The conflict involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and Colleen Hoover no longer reads like a single-axis dispute. It reads like structural separation, and structural separation reshapes outcomes. Public perception didn't just shift online, it shifted inside the industry. Because beyond the alleged smear campaign and disputed texts, there were claims of professional exclusion that reframed the conflict between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni as something more structural. And this is where it intensifies. Reports indicate Baldoni was effectively sidelined during the promotional tour, with emphasis placed on what was described as Blake's cut of the film. He has suggested he was asked to step down from certain creative positions and allow final editorial direction to move forward without him. That alone raises corporate tension. But here's where pressure builds. There were allegations of being excluded from the primary premiere positioning, placed separately from cast and executives, and not attending the official afterparty connected to the event. That's not just awkward optics, that signals power shift. And this is where it escalates. Because once creative control, press positioning, and event access begin to fracture, the dispute moves from personal disagreement into studio alignment territory, involving Sony, Wayfarer, and production leadership. Now, the battlefield changes again. It's no longer just who said what, it becomes who controls the platform. Who controls the edit? Who controls the narrative direction of the release strategy? That matters. Because the same period saw a separate brand launch, Blake Brown, rolling out around the August release, prompting online speculation about damage control and timing strategy. That doesn't prove coordination, but it amplifies perception, and perception compounds leverage. This is where it tightens around the midpoint. Because once public appearances, promotional hierarchy, and editorial authority all shift simultaneously, observers begin asking whether this was simply creative disagreement or a broader corporate recalibration. And that shifts leverage. If one party is isolated during the press tour, positioned separately at the premiere, and navigating headlines alone while others appear unified, the optics alone alter public interpretation. Meanwhile, online discourse on TikTok, amplified through coverage by the New York Times and entertainment outlets, continues shaping audience perception detached from internal studio dynamics. But here's the unresolved layer. If professional exclusion coincided with escalating backlash, was that a reactive move or part of a broader realignment? Because once corporate optics intersect with legal disputes and PR battles, the lines blur, and blurred lines create long-term consequences. The conflict between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni now extends beyond texts and into industry structure, and structural conflicts rarely resolve quietly. This is where it detonates. Because the conflict between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni didn't just play out behind closed doors, it exploded through headlines, and not subtle ones. Coverage from TMZ, Daily Mail, and Entertainment Weekly began framing the situation as a growing feud, with speculation about control, edits, and alleged tensions behind the scenes. That alone fuels momentum. But here is what complicates everything. Within the disputed texts, there are reported exchanges reacting in real time to those same articles, questioning strategy, debating whether to respond, even mocking how narratives were evolving. And this shifts leverage. Because once internal reactions to public stories surface, audiences start asking a different question. Was this organic media escalation or strategic positioning? That doesn't prove coordination, but it intensifies scrutiny. And this is where pressure spikes. There were reports suggesting Blake Lively had no plans to publicly address the feud, that she hoped the internet would handle the backlash for her. At the same time, there were discussions inside Baldoni's circle about staying positive, avoiding retaliation, and not amplifying the cycle. Two strategies, one narrative battlefield. And this is where it escalates, because the same period saw speculation that the August release timing was influenced by promotional friction, and that the launch of Blake Brown was being framed as unrelated despite proximity to the film's marketing push. Now we're in perception warfare. Online discourse across TikTok began accelerating theories about who was trying to cancel whom. Supporters lined up, critics hardened positions, and once cancel culture language enters the equation, nuance disappears. This is where it tightens around the spike. Because once both camps are reacting to media cycles, sharing links, debating damage control, questioning motives, the war becomes less about what happened and more about who controls the story. And controlling the story is leverage. But here's the unresolved tension. If the internal communications show awareness of media escalation, even frustration with it, why does the public framing remain binary? Villain, victim, smear, defense? Because headline warfare doesn't reward complexity, it rewards clarity. And clarity, even if partial, spreads faster. Now the battlefield overlaps completely. PR optics, corporate positioning, legal vulnerability. And when those collide, the outcome rarely hinges on one article. It hinges on momentum. The dispute involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and the surrounding production ecosystem has now fully entered the momentum phase. And momentum can either protect you or consume you. Now everything converges. Because the conflict between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni ultimately lands in one place: the lawsuit. An 89-page CRD draft complaint filed in California alleging a coordinated smear campaign supported by selective texts, internal strategy conversations, and public fallout. But here's where it tightens structurally. If the same body of communications includes denials about bots, discussions about avoiding escalation, and frustration with media narratives, then the strength of the framing depends entirely on interpretation, and interpretation becomes contested ground. This is where it escalates legally. Separate filings tied to Jennifer Abel reportedly raised concerns about unauthorized access, potential violations of the California Penal Code, and the use of a forensic tool to extract raw data. If those arguments gain traction, opposing counsel could attempt to challenge admissibility under poisonous tree doctrine principles. That doesn't decide the case, but it introduces vulnerability, and vulnerability changes leverage. Because if the evidentiary foundation of the 89-page CRD draft complaint is questioned, whether procedurally or technically, then the narrative built on top of it faces examination. Now we resolve the first loop. If full threads show complexity rather than coordination, the debate shifts from accusation to evidentiary weight. We resolve the second loop. If certain excerpts were elevated while others were omitted, critics will argue about cherry-picked messages versus contextual interpretation. But here's the third loop. If portions of the material are challenged as improperly obtained, what survives in court? That answer doesn't belong to social media. It belongs to judicial review. And this is where it sharpens. Because public discourse may amplify TikTok theories and headline cycles, but courtroom scrutiny operates differently. It examines process, consent, scope, intent, statute. And once statutory arguments referencing the California Penal Code, alleged promissory fraud, and claims of improper dissemination enter the record, the battlefield stabilizes. Not around outrage, around procedure. The reputational damage may already be circulating, but the legal outcome hinges on admissibility, interpretation, and burden. And that's the final leverage shift. Because in a dispute involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and surrounding production figures, narrative momentum can dominate headlines, but only procedural strength determines sustainability. And sustainability is what remains when the cycle moves on. Strip away the noise, and one question remains. If Blake Lively had access to the full texts, including denials about bots, internal debates over headlines, and private friction involving Justin Baldoni and Colleen Hoover, why did the conflict crystallize around a coordinated smear campaign narrative? That's not an accusation. It's a structural question. Because the dispute now lives in two parallel worlds. Online, it's fueled by TikTok, amplified by the New York Times, and refracted through entertainment coverage from TMZ and Daily Mail. In court, it centers on an 89-page CRD draft complaint, statutory references to the California Penal Code, allegations of unauthorized access, and arguments that certain materials could be challenged under poisonous tree doctrine principles. One battlefield runs on momentum. The other runs on procedure, and procedure decides sustainability. If evidentiary challenges weaken portions of the record, the narrative recalibrates. If the complaint withstands scrutiny, interpretation becomes decisive. Either way, perception alone won't resolve it. That's the loop still open. Because beyond the headlines, beyond the premiere optics, beyond the alleged media manipulation, the final outcome hinges on what survives review, and that review is still unfolding. So here's the question for you. Do you believe this was a narrative spiral amplified by momentum, or a coordinated campaign now under examination? Drop your take below, and if you want the next breakdown, including what happens if portions of the evidence are excluded, subscribe and stay locked in, because this story isn't closing, it's transitioning.